We move on now to part 2 of our memory chapter, the second half, where we will talk about the structures of the brain involved in declarative and non-declarative memory. We'll talk about research on the brain. We'll talk about physical proof of learning and memory in the brain. And finally, we'll finish off with forgetting. As you can probably tell from the lectures and links tab that I put up, there are a few videos for you to watch. The first two on HM and 51st Dates are the ones I show in class. The other ones are the Crash Course Psychology ones that hopefully help you get a better understanding of all of this, more than my own lecture. And you can watch those to get a better idea of memory systems and forgetting. So, getting back into this. What researchers used to tell us about the brain is that, or what they used to believe, is that our whole past was contained in memory, kind of like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. He had what was called an eidetic memory. No, that's not going to be on the exam, so don't worry. But the eidetic memory means that every single memory was stored in his brain. Now, for us, that's not exactly the case, and it may be that we don't want to oversaturate our brain, and if more important things come out, we need to have the room for them. Not really sure, but back in the 1960s or so, everybody was that was doing memory research was convinced our whole past was contained in our memory, waiting to be relived. Again, that's not the case, and newer findings tell us that where the information is stored is not in a single specific spot. Another movie that I like to reference in this memory chapter starred Jim Carrey. It was one of his roles that was serious and not slapstick comedy. So there's only a few of those. Truman Show, The Majestic, but this one was called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And in this movie, Jim Carrey was went through a bad breakup with his girlfriend, and she went to this place. This is science fiction, by the way. She went to a place that basically said that they could take all the memories of her ex, which was Jim Carrey, and zap them out of her brain. This would suggest, like the past research, that information, or like the movie Inside Out, was stored in one single specific memory or one spot of the brain, and they just kind of zap those neurons, and boom, any memory of that person is gone. Well, the problem is that's not the way that it actually works in the real world, although that was a really cool movie, and if you wanted to use that to do your movie for your final paper, that would be okay. So information is not stored in a single spot, like Inside Out or like in this movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. But it's more like that network that we talked about. So in the visual areas of the occipital lobe, that's where you'll find visual portions of memories. In the temporal lobe, you'll find the auditory portions. In the association areas for the parietal lobe, up top in the back, you will find the stuff that you touched or touched you that may cause memories in a good way or a bad way. Taste and smell in the frontal lobe. So perception, language, emotions, and more require these network of neurons, right? These neural networks or these spread out circuits. And that's what we find is going on with the brain. And in the last lecture, I talked about going to Disneyland and eating a churro, and just smelling churros awoke that memory. So you also may have heard that people's life flashes before their eyes, or they have flashbacks before they, have near-death experience or before surgery or things like that. Well, I'm also here to tell you in this portion of the chapter that our memories are not as rock solid as you would like to believe, especially based on things we see on TV and in the movies. Flashbacks during surgery that people have, or near-death experiences or things like that, are actually not memories that they are recalling, but that your stress hormones like cortisol and the emotional centers of the brain are kind of in overdrive, and these flashbacks are actually new creations of a stressed out brain. This also tells us why certain memories are more specific, I would say is the word, than others, and that's because of our emotional systems being involved. Now think about it. If you were to think back to an iconic time in your life, um, a memory of yours, which you'll also have to write about in the assignment, a memory of yours that is particularly specific or special or salient, right? That could be a memory of a really good time. It could be a memory of a really bad or scary time that your brain seems to have more information for. If I were to just say, recall the time you went to Disneyland. Oh, okay, the last time you went to Disneyland, okay, maybe nothing super special. But maybe the first time you went to Disneyland, where you were so excited and your emotions were going crazy, if you weren't too young to remember, that experience may stick out a lot more for you than just whenever the last time you went was. Or, if there was a time you went somewhere and there was a horrific car accident that you witnessed, right? You may have more details of that memory than any other time you went to that area. So we're going to get into that as well. But let's bring it back to where we sort of left off last time. We have the explicit or declarative type memories. Remember, that's memories for names, dates, experiences, and memories that you have. So first president, worst president, as I said, what you did for your 18th birthday, things like that. So the separation that we already talked about, the difference between explicit and implicit memory, is the fact that one is effortful and conscious, and the other is unconscious. Well, there is another difference that I alluded to between these systems, and that's in the specific brain structures that are used. So the explicit memory is stored, at least temporarily, in that part of the limbic system that we called the hippocampus. Remember how I said in chapter 2, bringing it back, that the temporal lobe is also has a memory function? Well, on the inside of the temporal lobe, just inside where the auditory cortex is the hippocampus. And remember that I talked about that in chapter 2 as well. Hippocampus means seahorse, and it is also your internal GPS. But I did say there was memory function involved. Well, specifically, the memory function of the hippocampus is to hold and be a temporary storage spot for declarative memories. So it registers and temporarily holds elements of these explicit declarative memories before moving them on to other brain regions, meaning the cortex, while you sleep. It gets transferred during sleep, during that NREM2 stage of sleep, into the cortex for long-term storage. So remember, when you're cramming, that's going into the hippocampus, but if it doesn't make it into the frontal, or into the cortex, I should say, I was going to say frontal lobes, it's all over the cortex. If it doesn't make it into the cortex through consolidation, then you're not going to be able to recall it. You can only hope to grab it from this short-term working memory in the hippocampus. So again, this neural storage of long-term memories going from a temporary short-term working memory to long-term memory is called consolidation. And the hippocampus and its surrounding structures are the ones that are responsible for this. This is different than the implicit memory systems. Remember that there are two implicit memory systems. One would be the classically conditioned associations, and the other one was procedural memory, which is riding a bike, signing your name, doing artwork, learning to cook better, learning a new dance move, right? So for both types of implicit memory systems, whether it's classically conditioned or whether it's learning a skill, the cerebellum and basal ganglia are your main parts of the brain. So remember back in chapter 2 when I said the cerebellum was for coordination of movement. Well, you can think about that in non-declarative memory that we call procedural memory. So memories of physical skills, which are also implicit memories. The cerebellum is coordinating. If you're learning a new dance move, or you're learning to hit a baseball at 90 miles an hour like they do in the major leagues, sometimes 100 miles an hour, you are using your cerebellum to help coordinate your movements. But I also told you that the cerebellum has other tasks that it is in charge of. So if you look at the top here, cerebellum plays an important role in forming and storing memories created by classical conditioning. So both of these systems employ the cerebellum. The basal ganglia, which we didn't really go over in chapter 2, which is just sort of underneath the frontal lobe, is a secondary motor center. And so it's helping the cerebellum out to form memories for both classically conditioned associations and procedural skills. So declarative memory is all just one thing. It's names, dates, things that you can declare. I can declare I had a bagel for breakfast. I can declare my son was in a bad mood this morning, right? I can declare what I did for my birthday last year. So that is the hippocampus. For implicit memory systems, it's the cerebellum and basal ganglia in both classically conditioned associations, which is the unconscious learning, or implicit, right? Associations, hear a loud noise and get startled. And for procedural memories, which is learning how to do something. Sometimes we call that muscle memory. And sometimes people wonder why it is, going back to the declarative memory system, that we have a lot of memories for things that we did. Sometimes we remember things better than others, but one of the things that you may notice and you may realize is that even though we see Stewie on Family Guy have, perfectly rational and formed thoughts and, well, plans to take over the world, one of the things in the real world that we don't seem to have are memories for before we were about the age of 3. I am looking out the window at my old house. When I was born, my family lived in the house directly across the street from where we are now, which seems silly that we just moved across the street, but it was only a 2-bedroom house. The one across the street had 3 bedrooms, and it was a nice corner house. The backyard across the street, pretty small. The backyard over here, bigger. Since we were on a corner, we had sort of 2 yards, a side yard and a regular patio backyard area. So because my brother and I shared a room for the first couple of years of my life, when the house across the street opened up, my dad jumped at the chance to move into a slightly bigger house. We also had a dog, so more backyard space for the boys and my brother and I, and for the dog. I don't really have any memories of that house other than knowing there was a family that rented that house when I was in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and they had children who were similar in age to my brother and I, so we hung out with them, and I went into the house a few times while we played. But I do remember having maybe one sort of fuzzy memory of the way the house looked when I was a kid, but I can't be sure if it's because it was a picture or if it was influenced by me going in later and sort of seeing it and thinking that I remembered it from 2.5. I do remember things from 3, but my memories aren't so great from that time. So why is that? Why is it that we can't remember things from before the age of 3? Some people can't remember things until after the age of 5 or 6. So this is a phenomenon that we call infantile amnesia. And the reason for this, it's defined as, any conscious memories or declarative memories of somewhere in the first 3 years of life being blank. The reason that scientists have come up with is because one of the things that is tied to our memory is actually our ability to talk. So command of language is one of the biggest things when you're talking about memories, is you need a way to describe it. And before you completely developed your language skills, right? Maybe you're talking a little bit and saying a little bit, a few words, putting sentences together, but you haven't really mastered language enough. And the fact that our hippocampus isn't really fully developed until after the age of 3. So you put those things together, command of language and a well-developed hippocampus and all its connections, kind of like we talked about with the five senses in chapter 6, right? How we had that sensory, if we had sensory restriction, right? We talked about that the visual system and auditory system and all of those needed to develop, and those connections needed to become stronger for a nice circuit. Well, this is the same thing with the hippocampus and our memories. So this idea of infantile amnesia is because we need a good command of language, which we don't normally have before the age of 3, unless you're Dr. C, and a well-developed hippocampus. And no, I have no idea if his hippocampus was fully formed before the age of 3, but he may have, later in life, he may have memories for things way before I could account for it, and that would be the reasoning. So going back to bring this issue to a close, and just to review, the frontal lobes, or the cortex, and the hippocampus share that structure. Remember that if we're talking about that central executive that's bringing information from the brain, information from long-term memories and bringing it back in working memory, then the frontal lobes is where everything, right, all the memories get coordinated and decision-making and all of that. So it would make sense that the hippocampus and the frontal lobes are working together for explicit memory formation. The hippocampus storing those declarative memories in the short term, and working with the frontal lobes in case we need to change or edit information that we've already stored in the brain. If you learn a new way to do things, that may cause a change in the way that you do things from now on, different ways to do math, although I will, in helping him out with his Common Core, I will never get used to that. But we'll talk about interference coming up. So hippocampus and the frontal lobes for explicit declarative memory. The basal ganglia and cerebellum are working together in both types of implicit memory. Remember, that is classically conditioned automatic associations, as well as as well as procedural memories like riding a bike or hitting a baseball or doing a new art project. And then on the bottom, you see next to the hippocampus, in chapter 2, we talked about this as part of the limbic system. This is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is actually the first one that we talked about, which is the fear and rage center of the brain. So it is one of those emotional centers in the limbic system. Anything tied to emotions, as I sort of alluded to a couple slides ago, can make you feel a certain way, right? Or it can make you remember things or bring back certain memories. And in fact, what we're going to learn as we get farther through this chapter is that we tend to have something called mood congruent memory, which means when we're in a good mood, we tend to think of other memories that we were in a similar mood. So if you're in a good mood, you tend to think of other good memories. When you're in a crappy mood, you tend to think of other crappy times or time memories from the same mood that you were in. And that's part of the amygdala. The amygdala can work actually both with explicit and implicit memories. When you're thinking about something, if you smell, maybe it's grandma's apple pie, and it brings you back to times that you remember your grandma, and it's nice. That would be an explicit memory that was brought about by, right, an emotion. If you're really scared and you hear something like a gunshot, and maybe that makes you think of a time that maybe you saw people commit a drive-by or something like that, and it made you really scared. You can see how the amygdala plays a role in both explicit declarative memory as well as implicit, like hearing the gunshots and dropping to the ground or something like that, or getting that startle reflex is definitely an implicit memory. And if it makes you scared, right, then or it causes an emotion like that, then it has evoked or used the amygdala. So the amygdala is emotion-related memory, and the amygdala is both or either declarative and non-declarative, explicit and implicit, right? So the amygdala works in both conscious and unconscious memory formation. So I just talked about how excitement or stress can trigger memories. Emotions and memories together can be a stronger connection. And so sometimes we see that memories that we can have more details about or that we remember more vividly are ones that were during a time when there was a lot of excitement or stress. As I said, if you went to Disneyland and you were really happy and excited, you may remember that trip a little more than, a few times later when you were just regularly excited, right? And this is especially true for things that are scary or sad, more than exciting or happy. So, why is it that our memory systems seem to recall more information, or we seem to recall more of this memory when we have our emotional centers or our limbic system working? Well, one of the things that our emotional centers do, besides make us feel happy, sad, scared, excited, blah, 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 is to trigger hormone production. One of the hormones I talked about, you've probably heard of, called cortisol, and that causes the body's fight or flight response. That causes other hormones like adrenaline, right? And what that does is with the emotional centers in the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, hypothalamus, we are putting the memory centers, hippocampus, right, as part of that. And the other memory centers, basal ganglia, cerebellum, all of those things into overdrive. And when you increase stress production and you increase hormone production and you're increasing limbic system production, then your memory centers are also on overdrive. So, as we know, our emotions persist with or without our conscious awareness. Sometimes we can be in a good or bad mood and have no idea why, because things are going about um, what we call flashbulb memories. And the reason that these are these memories that are more vivid and we tend to remember more events about them. So on a normal day of work, I might remember coming in, and it's kind of limited to sort of the main idea, right? I remember coming in, maybe who I saw when I walked in, maybe. I remember the classes I taught, and unless there was something that really caught me off guard, I was like, yeah, I lectured and people asked a few questions, and at the end, I was done. But I don't remember specific details. I couldn't tell you if Andrew was sitting in the very front. I couldn't tell you if Maria was sitting in the very back, unless that's a place that they always sat, right? So there wouldn't be in a regular memory anything that really stands out. However, when in these situations where you get really scared or something really big happens, a lot of times people remember a lot more details, such as maybe where people were sitting, exactly who was there that day that they talked to, and things like that. So we call those flashbulb memories because it's almost as if somebody took a still photograph using a flashbulb. Um, and this was a term before digital cameras, when you actually had the big, like the press had those giant flashes, right? So it's as if they took a picture and you're combing through your memory and you can see the specific aspects because you can almost see them in the picture. So let me give you an example of that. For my generation, the two probably biggest or most salient, the strongest flashbulb memories that I had were in 1986, and actually we just passed the anniversary of this. 1986 was the Challenger explosion. It was a space shuttle that was going into space, obviously, and before it even made it into space, it was it blew up in the atmosphere, and the people that were in it died. And the reason that it made it so memorable for me, especially, I was in second grade, by the way, is that there was a civilian on board, and it was the first time a non-astronaut, a regular run-of-the-mill American, was going to be going into space. And that person happened to be a teacher. It was a K through 12 teacher. They actually had a contest, or sort of a thing that teachers could apply to be the teacher to go up in space with the astronauts. And the reason for me that it was so significant. I feel like I can remember exactly where I was sitting in the class. I remember exactly where my teacher was and what she was doing, is because she was one of the top 50, at least, finalists, might have been top 20, to be that teacher to go into space. So it was almost her. And at that time in second grade, we had the little TV wheeled in, and we got to watch videos from a VHS tape, old technology. But this in second grade was the first time that my classmates and I got to watch a live broadcast on the TV. So for us, it was a big deal, right? We were already really excited. We were going to see a space shuttle launch and watch TV in the middle of class. I was sitting basically in the middle of the class, um, middle row, middle seat. And my teacher turned on, she put it kind of in the TV, kind of in the middle, small TV, and turned it on, turned on the news, and went and stood with her back against the back of the classroom, like where the one of the boards was. And so she was directly behind me. And so we watched the launch, and literally a minute or two after it actually launched into the atmosphere, before it even got out of the Earth's atmosphere, something went wrong. It blew up, and everybody on it died. So not only was it the first time we got to watch live TV, but it was the first time that I ever saw anybody die on live TV in real life as a second grader. So I remember where I was sitting. I remember the emotions, and I remember exactly where my teacher was, about 4 seats behind me, with her back on the wall, one leg up on the wall, and just tears streaming down her face. The other one for me was 9/11. I remember September 11th, 2001, and this is where I reveal where I used to work, which is not a problem for me. I just don't reveal it in class all the time because I want people asking me about assignments and things and not about where I worked. But I used to work at the Playboy Mansion as a butler, and I had just graduated from CSUN in 2001, and it was finally a time when I didn't have to work and go to school 7 days a week. But there were problems with the shifts. I worked the afternoon to evening shift. There was a graveyard shift and there was a morning shift. So the people in the morning shift said the graveyard didn't do their jobs. The people in my shift said the morning didn't do their jobs. The graveyard said we didn't do our jobs. And so my bosses decided for 1 week around September that people would, from one shift, would go, one person from one shift would go to another shift and kind of put themselves in the other person's shoes. And maybe we could work it out a little better and fight a little less. So that happened to be the week that I worked all morning shifts. I had to be in at 6:30 and I worked till 2:30. And as I've said, I'm not a morning person. So getting up that early and trying to function, not great. So on my way to work that day, I don't listen to the radio. I just listen to CDs in my car, listen to my favorite bands. This was before, obviously, streaming music. And when I got to work, I had no idea that anything was going on. So I walked by a TV we have outside in the break area, and I saw, in my haze of getting to work that early, about 6:20, I saw a plane hitting a tower, and I was like, what kind of weird movie is this? Because sometimes the maintenance guys or the gardeners get there early before I do, and they'll put on, some old movie or something. And then I walked closer and rubbed my eyes and realized, holy crap, this is real life. A plane just flew into one of the twin towers. And so I can remember exactly who I worked with. It was one guy that morning named JD. I can remember who was in the kitchen. I can remember a couple people that were in security. This was before the rest of the offices opened and before Hef woke up and all of that. And then I had to squeeze orange juice for, in case anybody staying at the house wanted fresh orange juice. We squeezed them from actual oranges. So I remember going out to the break area where the oranges were, and I looked out and I was like, oh, they must be showing a replay of the plane hitting the tower. Nope, took a closer look, second plane hitting the second tower. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I went in and I told them about that. And then maybe an hour after that, we heard that the Pentagon had gotten hit by a plane as well. I didn't see that one actually on TV. I don't know if they actually had video for it because I didn't see it at that time. They did show damage later from the plane hitting it. And then at about 9:15, I remember getting a call from a girl who was not very bright. She was one of Hef's girlfriends, and she said, "Hey," I said, "Playboy Mansion, can I help you?" And she said, "Hey, I just heard that the Pentagon got hit. Is that true?" And I said, "Yeah, about 20, 30 minutes ago, we heard the same thing, that not only did the towers go down, but the Pentagon got hit." Oh my goodness. And then she said to me, "How many Pentagons do we have?" And at that point, I just had no patience for that kind of stupidity. So I said, "Oh, hold on for a second." And I put the phone down. I said, "JD, it's for you," because I wasn't about to deal with that. The point is, I could remember very specific details about exactly who I worked with, which changed a lot. I could remember exactly the call and the time, and I can remember these very vivid, specific details that I wouldn't have been able to remember on a regular day of work, especially because I wasn't a morning person and it was so early that I could barely function that early in the morning. So those are flashbulb memories. For my parents' generation, it was probably remembering where you were, who you were with, and what you were doing when Kennedy was shot in Dallas. And for you guys, really, other than this pandemic, um, I would probably say where you were, especially for our demographic at ELAC, where you were the night you found out Trump actually got elected. Some people threw things, some people really cried. There was a lot of emotions going on, and most of them were probably not good ones, right? So this would be about the time where I'd ask you guys to come up with stories, but we don't have that luxury, so I'll move on. Here is something that is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to lie, but I will give you the take-home message, and if I were to ask for this on an exam, I'm going to tell you pretty much how you would want to remember this. So in the 60s and 70s, when they used to think that everything was stored in the brain and we had a trace of everything, in psychology, we have a lot of things that can't be measured directly. We have, and we call these things constructs. The term intelligence, we can't actually see intelligence. We can give you an IQ test, and the higher you score, the more intelligent you are, but we can't see physical proof of that. And emotions, we can tell that somebody's more angry. We can take their blood pressure. We can see how red in the face they get, or how many times they cuss in traffic. But we can't actually directly measure it. So learning and memory specifically, used to be thought of that way, as a construct, that we can see from a memory test how many things people get right. And of course, we could relate that to their memory, but there was no physical proof of learning and memory in the brain. And then in the late 70s, they finally published a paper in the early 80s. There were two researchers named Kandel and Schwartz, and they said, what if we could go inside the neurons in the brain and try to see if there were changes that took place? So I'm going to kind of go from the bottom of the slide up. Kandel and Schwartz took a sea slug, as you can see on the left, the California sea slug called the aplysia. And the reason they used a sea slug, because you're wondering, like, okay, we've heard mice, rats, we've heard, monkeys, maybe cats and dogs. Why a sea slug? Well, a sea slug has really, really thick, big axons. So it was easy to stick an electrode into the axon of the sea slug to see if there are any changes. And what they did was they went into sort of a serotonin neuron, and they said, okay, let's review from chapter 2. How do action potentials work? They said that if you have enough change in voltage, right, increase in voltage, it reaches the threshold, and then boom, you have an action potential, and it causes the cell to fire. And cells can fire faster or slower depending on the stimulus. So Kandel and Schwartz had this brilliant idea. They said, we can put an electrode into an axon, and we can give it electricity, give it a little zap. If you give it enough electricity to reach the threshold, you can artificially cause action potentials, which means you can cause the cells to fire more than they would in real life. So what they did was they decided, well, if we give it enough stimulation, enough amps, right? If we give it enough energy, enough zapping to cause action potentials every time we do it, what if we fired 100 zaps in a row? So they called it a train of impulses. What if we fired 100 electrical impulses in a row, pop, 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 right? We would probably see more firing of the, more action potentials, more chemicals. But would that last? So the question was, if we gave 100 stimulations in a row and 100 action potentials in a row, that would cause an increase in the cells firing, but would it cause an increase in the cell that would stick around? Would it increase and then go right back down to normal, or would it actually stay increased? Right? So we have the cell that fires and we have the cell that picks it up, right? So they invented something called long-term potentiation, which they believed is something that happens automatically, but they did it obviously artificially. So long-term potentiation, let's go back up to the top, is an increase in a synapse's firing potential. Now remember, the synapse is the connection between the sending cell and the receiving cell, the lock and the key, right? The sending cell sends the neurotransmitter, the receptor picks it up like a lock and a key, so it has to go to the right place. And so what they did was they gave a serotonin neuron 100 trains, right? 100 trains of impulses in a row, bop, 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 and it caused a lot more serotonin to be released. But would that be enough to make changes on the other side where they pick up the cells, right? Pick up the neurotransmitters. So what Kandel and Schwartz showed in 1982 was that more serotonin was released and the efficiency of the cell increased, which meant not only did that specific synapse cause more of the serotonin to be taken up, but more synapses started doing it. And this increase did not go down after 20 or 30 minutes. It stayed for a long time. So after LTP, the brain does not seem to be less efficient. It seems to increase its output. So after LTP, they found the brain does not really erase those activities. It doesn't erase memories. So this was believed to be the neural basis for learning and memory. Now that sounds like a lot. But my take-home message here, right, not how does LTP work or what does it do or how do you conduct it. It's this one. It's that LTP, long-term potentiation, is believed to be the neural basis of learning and memory. So can I explain to you how it works? I'm going to try. So let's just say that a normal connection between cells is like, we'll call it a 1.0, right? You have a little bit of neurotransmitter, and you can see in the picture on the left in A, let's say you have a little bit of neurotransmitter, and it gets picked up by a receptor on the next cell. Now, if you cause that big train of action potentials, you'd have more neurotransmitter released, but you still only have the one dendrite to pick it up. So you wouldn't really see an increase in the whole synapse unless the other cell, like in B, compensated for that, right? So here, an electron microscope shows just one receptor and getting a little bit of neurotransmitter. So that's a 1.0 on the left. If we double the amount of output and we double the amount of neurotransmitters, we'd also have to double the amount of receptors to pick it up. And that's what we see in B here. In B, after LTP, the receptor sites have doubled. So effectively, the strength of this connection went from a 1.0 to a 2.0. And even though Kandel and Schwartz did it artificially by using electricity, this is believed to be what happens when we learn something new. So if we go back to the idea of the bell and the food with Pavlov and his dog, the bell by itself doesn't really mean anything. That's a 1.0. The dog will turn its head because it hears a sound, but bell doesn't mean anything. Food is really strong. Food is like a 2.0. When we pair bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, that bell becomes meaningful. Bell now signals that there's going to be food. Eventually, like we talked about in chapter 7, when you ring the bell and pair it with the food enough times, at the end of acquisition, you ring the bell and the dog drools just as much as if there was food there, right? So in that case, if we think about that from the brain standpoint, once the bell becomes paired with food, it becomes stronger. So the bell, which was a 1.0, like the picture on the left, is now like a 2.0, like the picture on the right. And just ringing the bell is going to cause the dog to learn that means food. So we've gone from a 1.0 to a 2.0. So really quickly, just going back, LTP is an increase in the firing potential, but it also means there's increases in the receiving cell, in the dendrites of the next cell. After LTP, once we've learned something, the brain does not erase it. That activity increases and it goes from a 1.0 to a 2.0 in theory. So this, again, the take-home message is this is believed to be the neural basis for learning and memory, or, as I said earlier, physical proof of learning and memory. When we learn something, the synapses get stronger, they strengthen. When that information that we learned goes into long-term storage, it gives us more activity, it gives us more dendrites, it increases the activity of those cells. So it's believed to be the neural basis or the physical proof of learning and memory in the brain, not just a construct. One of the things that I also alluded to earlier in this chapter is that if we look at the brain like that complex circuit and not that, not like memories being stored in one place like Inside Out or the computer program, our memories are a mixture of different areas of neurons, right? It's a whole entire circuit or network. And all we have to do is sort of pick one point and stimulate that one point. So just smelling churros from Olvera Street or somewhere else may cause us to have the entire memory of eating the churros and being with family or friends or both at Disneyland. So sometimes, in order to retrieve a memory, we don't have to recall the entire memory. We just need to have one little part of that circuit stimulated, so to speak. And so these serve as what we call retrieval cues for the memories. I'm going to go over 4 different types of retrieval cues. One of them we already talked about in priming in chapter 6. That's where I got people to think about stopping at a green light, right? Not a good idea. But there are other ways to do that. So priming, which is how subliminal messages would have worked, and other types of retrieval cues are depending on where you learn the information, what mood you're in, as I alluded to, and maybe in what position the material comes to you that you may remember more or less. So let's look at these retrieval cues. First of all, again, memory retrieval is held in a circuit or a storage of web or a web of associations, however you want to think of it, a network of neurons, a circuit, however you want to talk about that. And so in order to retrieve this memory, we just have to find an anchor point or hit a point on the circuit that activates the circuit, right? So these retrieval cues can serve as anchor points for the memory that's suspended in this web. Once you activate that circuit, you've pretty much recalled the memory, or as much of it as you can remember. And the best retrieval cues we have come from things we learned at the time that it was encoded. When it was encoded, we were at a specific place, we were in a specific mood, and there may be little details that can help us to retrieve the entire memory. The first one that I talked about is called priming. And again, as a review from chapter 6, priming is an activation, often an unconscious activation, of a particular association. So again, if we're thinking about priming, right, it could be the churro, it could be smelling grandma's apple pie that will, and I'm going back to smells, right, that will make you think of good times with grandma, abuela, whoever, and I can also go back to an example I gave you in chapter 6, and that example is driving home past, and actually I gave this for some of you in class, driving home, not noticing new flowers, and then all of a sudden, right, I had this idea that I wanted to buy my wife flowers for Mother's Day, birthday, whatever it is, and then I drive by this place, and not even knowing why, um, all of a sudden I get this memory that, oh, I was going to buy my wife flowers. And really, it could have just been primed by the flowers that were in somebody's garden that I drove by. So consciously, I didn't even realize it. But unconsciously, my brain made the connection. And I was like, oh, right, I was going to go buy my wife flowers. So priming is this idea of awakening some sort of association. Sometimes it happens consciously. A lot of times it's unconsciously or implicit. And so in class, what I would normally say is, hey guys, how do you spell the word hair? The word hair, you would say, oh, you would associate it with the, that stuff on top of your head that I'm wrapping raw end of the stick, or at least her parents did, because man, as soon as this quarantine came about, Georgia and her family were in charge of the rabbit. And guess what? No school the rest of the year? I guess they're taking care of that rabbit for weeks and months, right? So if I told you that story first, and then I asked you guys how to spell the word hair, some of you may have actually thought before H-A-I-R, because I was talking about a rabbit, some of you would have actually maybe spelled it H-A-R-E. And this is what we call priming. So seeing or hearing the word rabbit, like if I gave you a story about a rabbit in my son's class, activates the mental concept of a rabbit, or a hare, like or if, especially if I maybe read to you guys or told you that my son's class was reading The Tortoise and the Hare, that famous story about slow and steady winning the race, right? Ugh, moral stories with morals. So it primes the spoken word H-A-R-E instead of H-A-I-R, which if you weren't primed would be your most common spelling of hair, if you think about it, right? The most popular application. Just like when we talked about the word house, if I'm not priming you for something like a TV show, you'd probably just think of where you live as a house, right? So that's what we call priming. And that could be one way to retrieve a memory. Just driving by the flowers made me remember that I was going to buy my wife flowers before I came home. The other types of retrieval cues are context-dependent memory, and what we call state-dependent or mood-congruent. Context-dependent memory says that we tend to recall information better where we encoded the memory than anywhere else. So the reason why besides it would be a pain in the butt to move people around, but the reason why we take exams in the same room where we learn the information, or at least the advantage to that, is that we can recall the information better where we learned it. So if you actually paid attention in class while I was lecturing, chances are you're going to remember that information better if you take the exam in the same room. So what this says is that context-dependent memory involves improved recall of specific information when the context present at encoding level and retrieval are the same. And this also gives us our encoding specificity principle, that the cues and contexts that are specific to a memory will be most effective. When I was at UCLA, our final exams were in a different room than our regular class and other exams. And I tried to, after learning this concept, tell the higher ups that I feel like you're setting me up for a little bit of failure because you're giving me the final in a different room than when I met, than where I, encoded the information. And they said, well, you can either take it or you can't. And so of course I took it and I was fine, but the argument still stood. This is also why in a court of law, especially for eyewitness memory, that we don't necessarily have the best idea for details. You're doing it in a courtroom, sometimes months or years afterwards. So that's why the presentation of evidence that was at the scene of the crime, the murder weapon, if it was a murder trial, or whatever it was, exhibit A, exhibit B, helps people's memories because it's context specific to the actual scene of the crime. And so that's why we do that. In 1975, I think it was actually Battley that did this experiment. Maybe it wasn't, but it was around that time. They wanted to, they had people that were learning words near the ocean. So there were people, half of the subjects or participants learned a list of words outside of the water, like on the water, on the beach or something like that. And the other half of them were underwater in the actual pool or beach or whatever with gear on. So they either learned a set of words, it was like 20 words, on land or underwater. And then they split those groups in half, and half of them recalled the information on land or underwater. So that gave 4 groups. One that learned it on land and recalled it on land, one that learned it on land and recalled it underwater, one that learned it underwater and recalled it on land, and one that learned underwater and recalled underwater. And if this idea of context-dependent memory were true, what they would find in this experiment is that those that learn the words underwater would be better and recall more underwater, and those that learned it on the land would recall more on the land. And that's exactly what they found. Those who learned on land and tried to recall underwater, or learned underwater and tried to recall on land, got 3 or 4 less words on average than the people who learned where, or who recalled it where they learned it. So this definitely does seem to be a thing. State dependent, or what we also call mood congruent memory, involves the tendency to recall events consistent with the mood you are in. When you're in a really good mood, the first memories that come to mind are also going to be in that same mood that you were in. So that's why somebody who's in a really crappy mood, or a lot of times people who are depressed, which includes a depressed mood, we'll go over that in chapter 15. You try to tell them, sometimes you come over and they're in a really bad mood and you say, come on, snap out of it. Think of all the good memories that we had together. And they'll say, well, I remember that time you ditched me when we were supposed to go to this concert. And you're like, that doesn't help. And you think that they're just being negative Nancy's or whatever, right? But this seems to be a phenomenon with the brain that not only do we have context-dependent memories, but we have mood congruent memories. So we tend to recall experiences that are consistent with our mood. If we're really scared, the first memories that our brain offers us up are other times we were scared. If we're in a crappy mood, the other memories we tend to recall the most easily are the ones that were in the same sort of mood that we were in. So we have priming, we have context dependent, and we have state dependent or mood congruent memory. The last thing that we're going to, the last type of thing is when we learn a list, our brain seems to gravitate towards the first item and last item on the list. That's because if I tell you to, I'm going to give you a list of words and I want you to remember as many of those words as possible, that the first item on the list is called the primacy effect, and it's because that's the anchor of your list. The list starts there, so you better remember that first word. The last word on the list is the recency effect. It's the last one you heard, so it's the most recent in your brain, and so we tend to remember that one better. This is called the serial position effect. If I give you a list of words, and sometimes I do this when we're actually in the class, most people in the class tend to remember the first and last words. The ones in the middle get a little murky. So that's the recency and primacy effect. And those are the 4 types of retrieval cues. The last thing that we're going to talk about, I guess there's sort of 2 things left, is this idea of why we lose information. So forgetting. There are many different theories as to why we forget. One of the things that I made clear in chapter 7 in the classical conditioning, when we talked about spontaneous recovery, is the fact that there's no such thing as unlearning something. Once the brain learns an association, it doesn't simply unlearn. That's not a thing. If you use LTP as an example, we don't have LTP and then it breaks. It can go back to normal, but we don't unlearn something. We can forget. We can learn that there's a different association, but we don't unlearn. So, talking about the two-track mind, as a reminder, we have an implicit, automatic, non-declarative system for memory, unconscious, and we have a conscious, explicit, declarative memory. We know that they're controlled by different parts of the brain. So again, hippocampus for declarative memory, connected to the frontal lobes, cerebellum and basal ganglia for the implicit, automatic, classically conditioned, or procedural memories, and the amygdala, which is involved in the emotional component of both implicit and explicit, or declarative or non-declarative and declarative. So we've already established this. Now, with forgetting, there may be several causes. One of the things that we're bringing back is this idea of, remember the Atkinson-Shiffrin or two-Dix model, is that information has to first be encoded. A sensory memory has to be encoded into a short-term or working memory, temporary storage, and from there, through consolidation, it has to be encoded into long-term memory before we can even recall it. If this encoding is incomplete or improper, doesn't work, well, then we're never going to remember it in the first place or be able to recall it because it never made it to that third stage, to long-term memory. Once up there, if we don't use it, we may lose it. Kind of like if you store old stuff in the attic and over the years they collect dust or they start to decompose, fade away, right? Old papers and things like that. So that may be the same thing with your memories in your brain if you don't use them. So we may get what we call storage decay. Sometimes we have the answers, but something just seems to be blocking us from being able to remember it. So we have it up there. Sometimes it's on the tip of our tongue, and it's just hard to remember it. So we have retrieval failure. I know that when somebody asks me a question, I'm of that time before phones and Google, where we actually needed to know the answer. And so sometimes with old 90s trivia, some of my friends and I, we like to try and remember them before we resort to looking it up and admitting to failure. So if there's a 90s pop culture reference that my friend can't remember and he asks me, I try to remember before I Google it. Sometimes I remember right away, boom. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes. Sometimes we'll hang up or we'll stop texting and then like 4 hours later, I'm like, that was the answer. So sometimes retrieval failure can be just delayed. Sometimes you never remember, even though it was up there. And there are sometimes, on the next one, we have interference, where a new or old piece of information or way of doing things can actually get in the way of us remembering. And that's what we call interference. So think of it as having to do a new password for your computer, right? And the new password, you're either so used to your old one that you can't remember the new one you changed it to, or when you change it to the new one, it's used so much and it's so new that you forget the old password or the old way of doing things. That's what we call interference. And going back to our old friend Freud, who we will get more into in a couple chapters, sometimes we're motivated to forget, whether the information is just not important enough, it's kind of boring, or maybe we don't want to remember because it's such a horrible thing. We don't want to oversaturate our neurons, and so maybe forgetting is a motivated thing. We'll get into all of these right now. So encoding failure could be dependent on, like we talked about with working memory, your age. The older you get, there's an encoding lag that seems to be linked to age-related memory decline. So not necessarily dementia or anything like that, but which is a type of memory loss. But just as people get older, as our DNA is breaking down, we may not remember as much, or it may take longer to process these things. Of course, if we weren't really paying attention to something the first time, if we think about a sensory memory that's encoded to working memory or short-term memory, if we fail to notice, if we fail to put our attention on it, this could contribute to memory failure. Although, would you call it memory failure so much as it just never got stored? So this could be that a sensory memory didn't get encoded to short-term or working memory, or it made it to short-term working memory, but didn't get encoded or consolidated into a long-term memory. If it never made it into long-term storage, there's a 0% chance that you can recall it because it's not there. So that's the first one. Storage decay, the more that we bring up a memory, right, that's declarative, we talked about this earlier in the chapter, the more it could be, feel like it's automatic or implicit. But even if we remember things in school, but we don't use them for a while, they can just kind of be up there collecting dust, right, or starting to decay. The more we use them, the more we bring them up, the more we strengthen that connection because we're recalling them regularly. So with storage decay, what memory researchers say is that the course of forgetting is initially rapid. Once we learn something, if we keep encoding it and we keep studying it before the exam, chances are we'll tend to remember it longer. But if you learn it in class and then you just don't go over your notes, it may be gone. The course of forgetting is initially rapid and then levels off with time. So if we recall it within the same day or week that we learned it, it tends to stay and it tends to be stronger. But if we don't recall it for a while, right, we can lose it. So an example that I like to give is a doctor in the field, not a doctor like me, Dr. B, but like a medical doctor who took maybe her last or his last chemistry class in undergrad. Maybe they didn't have to take chemistry for, med school or anything like that. And so this person is, 50 years old, and the last time they took chemistry was maybe 25, 30 years before. There may be certain parts of chemistry and things they need to understand for medication, but certain specific equations. Let's say that this person has, this doctor, she has a child that's going to college now, and saying, yeah, I'm taking chemistry right now, and there's this equation that I learned. And the doctor, who's the mom, was like, I didn't remember that, right? Because it had been 20 or 25, 30 years since she had last used it in school, right? So it could be that it just decayed. For me, the example at the very beginning of the chapter last lecture was remembering the words to a song. And there may be some annoying song that you remember all the words to, and it kind of annoys you because you hate that song. There's a few of those for me. And then there's songs that you really loved, and you just haven't listened to them in a while, and you just can't remember all the words. In that case, that could be a bit of storage decay, but you kind of knock off the rust when you listen to it again. Remember, once you relearn it, you can relearn it faster. So you may only need to hear it through 1 or 2 times, and boom, it all comes back again. Storage decay could also be this idea of memory trace, or LTP, that physical changes in the brain occur. When the memory forms, you go up to a 2.0, and maybe if you haven't used it in a while, it starts to go back down again. So we get a little bit of decay. So again, looking at encoding failure, we have sensory memory. We have to give it some attention so it gets to working short-term memory. And then we encode later into long-term memory. So if we don't get enough sleep, if we didn't rehearse it or practice it enough to get it, to encode it properly, then it's blocked from long-term storage, and we cannot remember what we've never encoded, or at least not encoded properly. So what type of reasons are there for encoding failure? Well, maybe it could be that events and memories are not available because they were never truly acquired. Maybe they've been discarded due to stored memory decay, and we just don't have the proper way to bring them back. What about retrieval failure? Sometimes insufficient information to access memories makes them out of reach. If you're tired, if you're not paying attention, If you're older, a lot of these things may block you from remembering things. And so it may be on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't get it. Sometimes with these trivia things, I give up, and then 3 days later, I'm like, oh, that's the name of the band that he was thinking of, or she was thinking of, right? So moving on to the last two, motivated forgetting, I'll go into because it's a little bit quicker. So I'll go into that one first. Freud said that we repress or push down our memories into the deep, dark depths of our unconscious mind so we can never access them as a way to protect ourselves. So any bad memories or scary things, we don't want to have a full memory for, because if we bring it back, there's a lot of trauma involved. So we're trying to protect our self-concept, our ego, and minimize anxiety from these things. So Freud would say that we're motivated to forget so that we don't have to relive these horrible things. Today, it's more about saving room in the brain for more important stuff, or that attempts to forget are more likely when information is neutral or boring and not emotional. For interference, we have two different flavors. Interference means that some new way that you learn something interferes with the old way of doing it, so you don't remember. That's retroactive, is when learning something new disrupts the old information. Proactive is when older memories make it really hard for you to remember new ways to do things. So an example of proactive interference, I'll use the password example. I'm so used to my old password, and ELAC makes me change my password every 3 to 4 months, at least 3 or 4 times a year. I have to change my password because I'm not allowed to. To make it easier, somebody told me, and I still haven't done it yet, just use the date, right, the month and year that you're changing it to, and that way it'll make it easier to remember. I'm like, oh yeah, I should do that. I'm lazy as it is. Nope. I never do it, right? And my old usual password for things, I try to, since nowadays we have like 1,000 different passwords for 1,000 different things, for banks, for Facebook, for everything, right? Just to get into Netflix, you have to have a password. And so, of course, for security purposes, you don't want it always to be the same. But I always have I try to have sort of a version of one that I can remember, because how am I supposed to remember 1,000 to 2,000 passwords, right? So whenever I have to change it, it's really hard for me to remember the new password change because my old one was finally familiar. So for password changes for my email and for access to ELAC, proactive interference occurs a lot, right? Maybe that won't happen so much if I actually go with the month and date that I change it, but then now all of you will know my secret. So I don't know. I don't know. Retroactive interference, on the other hand, moving on. Um, Although I'm talking to myself and you guys can't answer me, so I don't know why I'm skirting the issue. Retroactive interference is when new learning disrupts your memory for the older way. So if you learn to play the guitar a certain way, and then you learn a more proper technique or a newer technique, and you totally can't remember the old way to do things, that would be retroactive information or interference. Learning a new way to type, you totally forget the old way of just using 2 fingers, and well, you probably want to forget that way anyway. My example that I use in class is when I was 8 years old, I learned to play the piano. The piano, you have your right hand playing the upper notes, your left hand playing the lower notes. One is called, on the right hand, the upper register. We call it treble clef, and we learn to read the music with treble clef. On the bottom hand is called bass clef, and it is not the same things. The notes in the same spaces are not the same. It's actually sort of 2 steps below. So what would look like an A on, what would look like or I should say, what would look like a C in treble clef would be an A in bass clef. But when you're learning to do it together, pretty easy. So for the first 3 years, I played piano, 8, 9, and 10. And then when I was about 10 or 11, I decided I wanted to, in 5th grade, play another musical instrument. So I stopped piano lessons, and in school, I started playing the clarinet. Clarinet is only treble clef. So from 5th grade to 11th grade, 6 straight years or 7 straight years, or so, I played the clarinet, which was specifically just treble clef. So I never stopped knowing how to read music in that way. But then when I got to Santa Monica College, there was one summer I only needed to take one class, and I'm like, well, should I take something else while I'm here that's going to be easy, like a 1-unit class, since I'm already doing this? And then I saw they offered a piano class, and it was not very expensive. And I was like, well, I haven't played piano, played piano since I was like 10. I still know what the notes look like and stuff, but just to knock some of the rust off, and since it's right after the class I finished, why don't I just go try and take easy intro piano class? See if I still got it. And what I found was that reading treble clef, which I'd been doing for years, no problem, real easy. Reading bass clef, I couldn't read it the way that it was. Because of all the treble clef itself, reading bass clef, I had to basically transpose the notes in my head. So if I saw them and they looked like C, D, E, I had to remember it was A, B, C and sort of make the correction in my head. So retroactive interference is when new learning disrupts your memory for the old way of doing things. Proactive is the opposite, when the older memory, because you're so used to doing it a certain way or you're so used to a certain password, makes it harder to remember the new password that you changed it to. And I find that proactive interference and passwords is a very good example these days. So, when do we forget? Forgetting can really occur at any stage if you think about it that way. As a sensory memory, you have to have at least a little bit of attention to even get it into short-term memory. If not, most of the things that we see are poof, gone, unless we go back to the dream examples and maybe they're stuck in this buffer. But they never made it into conscious thought, so they're never going to make it, unless they're classically conditioned, they're really never going to make it into long-term memory. For working in short-term memory, sometimes items are noticed and encoded, but maybe they don't get consolidated because you don't have sleep. Maybe they weren't rehearsed enough. Maybe they're incomplete. You didn't really practice them. Or sometimes they make it to long-term storage and they either decay or you just fail to retrieve them for whatever reason. You're distracted, you're tired, you're older, something like that. So retrieval can also depend on, do we have the appropriate retrieval cues to bring them to activate that circuit? Is there proactive or retroactive interference going on? Are we in the right mood to be able to remember it? Are we motivated to remember or forget it? It could be any of those. And of course, at the end of the day, it's not an exact science. So sometimes things get retrieved right away. I remember that information. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's an hour to 5 hours later. Sometimes it's never. As we process information, we're filtering it, we're altering it. And you know what? Most of the stuff that comes in is not always remembered. So this brings us to our last sort of concept for the day. And I know that this is running a little longer than a normal one, but I didn't want to break it up into 3 lectures when I didn't really need to. So when we remember things, we tend to think of our memory as, some people talk about the mind as a steel trap, and that everything we remember all the details, it doesn't get fuzzy. And now, from listening to me ramble on, you know that unless it's a flashbulb memory, that maybe we're only limited to remember only certain parts of it. I think our memory system may have to work too hard if everything was going to be great. This also becomes a problem, that our memories are not as rock solid as we think they are. This becomes a problem in the court system when you have people relying on eyewitness memory of exactly what happened and exactly what went down in exactly the right order in order to convict or not convict somebody of committing the crime. So here's what lends to even more craziness, is we have what's called misinformation and imagination effects. So one thing that happens when your memory is consolidated is when you first recall a memory, it may become, it has to be what we call reconsolidated once you put it away. So if you get different information and you accept that information, when you restore that memory again, the wrong information will come up. So This is called the misinformation effect, and this occurs when a memory has been corrupted by potentially misleading information. This could be something you dreamed coming into a memory that you had and distorting it, or it could be somebody giving you the wrong information. So again, in class, I like to use this example that, I was hanging out with my friends at a party, and maybe something funny happened, something embarrassing happened, or something like that, right? So in this story, I'm telling my wife, I'm like, yeah, I went to this party one time with, a little while ago, I went to this party with Tony, with Seth, and with Roger, right? And Seth is over at the house, and he says, it wasn't Roger, it was Tony, me, and Charles. And I was like, oh, really? Was it? Oh, okay. I mean, you're telling me this. So instead of saying Roger, I say Charles. And then I put that memory back away. And then every time that I um, bring up that story again, I'm like, man, we went to this party one time with Charles and Seth and Tony. And it was actually Roger. I remembered it correctly. But Seth gave me a piece of wrong information, as Seth tends to do. And I remembered it, and I stored it back in my long-term memory as a different person that went to the party with us. And I would swear up and down every time I do it that it was 100% correct, right? So any misleading information and any corruption, things like that, could actually go back and be stored as an actual memory. So our memories, and you would not fail a lie detector test because you would be 100% truthful. Your brain would actually think it was Charles and not Roger, right? This is what's called the misinformation effect. The imagination effect actually can occur as well in a similar way. By imagining fake actions and events can actually create memories for them. So this could be thinking that a dream you had. This could either be misinformation or imagination, right? A dream you had thinking it was a real life event, and it creates an actual memory of it. Or it could be a story that somebody tells you. So here's another example from Playboy. One time I was there after a party, and it was a luncheon type of party, so it went really early in the day, not very usual. And I stayed to hang out and help out in the pantry while cleaning up was done and they were getting ready for dinner and things like that. So I get a call from the grotto, which was sort of a jacuzzi that was inside a rock, kind of like a little secluded hideaway. It was really cool. And I get a call, and so I pick up the phone. Butler's Pantry, can I help you? Can we get 4 shots of tequila Patron to the grotto? And I was like, okay. And I remember that we had to put them in plastic cups because the grotto and jacuzzi was connected to the pool. And if any actual glass got in there, you'd have to drain the whole damn thing and clean it out before putting water back in, which is a process. So we avoided that by using plastic cups. So I remember chilling the Patron, cutting up some lime and salt, pouring 4 shots into the plastic cups. And at that point, in case interesting activity was happening, you had to announce yourself if you were coming in someplace that you could startle people. So as I was walking into the grotto, I said, Butler here with your drinks. And I'm not allowed to describe what I saw, but it was memorable, shall we say. And all I remember is that there were 3 people in the grotto. And when I walked in, I counted on 1, 2, 3, and I said, really quick question, don't want to disturb you from whatever it is you're doing, but why are there 4 shots of tequila when there's only 3 of you there? And one of the playmates who was in there, she said, well, one's for you, silly. Now, I think I was maybe 20. I don't even think I was 21 yet. Maybe I was already 21. But I wasn't really a person that drank on the job, especially at like 5 o'clock, when I could have been leaving pretty soon. But I took a look at what was going on. I grabbed that shot of Patron before they even got over to the tray, and I said, cheers, took the shot, walked back in the house. When I walked back in the house, I must have had a really interesting look on my face because my coworker, Zach, was like, what just happened? So I told him, I got an offer. I got a call for 4 shots of tequila. I went in there. I told him what I saw. They told me one was for me. I took the shot and I walked out. He thought that story was amazing. So, about a half an hour later, I heard him telling the story to somebody else as if he was the one that brought them the drinks. And I'm like, okay, cool, you can have that one, no worries. And then a week later, and a month later, and it finally occurred to me a couple months later, maybe 2 or 3 months later, that when he was telling this story, the same story he'd been telling, he actually believed, I could just hear it in the way he told the story, he actually believed that it was him that took them the drinks and not me. And so this imagination effect is absolutely a thing. This was a complete false memory that he perceived to be one of his own. And again, if you were to give him a lie detector test, I could guarantee you he would pass, because it wouldn't be a lie to him. His brain actually believed that it was him in the story. So most of our memories, again, unless they're very specific on details, we don't always have all the information. We're kind of stuck to the perimeter or the gist. I remember going to the party. I remember some of the people I was with. Could I tell you exactly what I did at exactly what time? Not unless it was a story like 9/11 or the Challenger explosion, right? So we tend to have faulty memories for specific details. Sometimes we don't exactly remember how, when, or where. Sometimes we can remember a detail so vivid, but I don't remember the name of that restaurant or where it was. I remember I saw sawdust on the floor. I remember I saw this person throwing up and, the ambulance had to come and blah, blah, blah. But I just can't remember where we were or what year it was. So there's a lot of that. Our memories, this is another way to show you that our memories are not rock solid. They are not necessarily dependable. And lawyers actually make use of this in a court of law. They try to discredit you by forming questions in a way that you're not prepared to answer. They make you change how you were originally going to say something. If you're talking about marijuana legalization, you could say, do you think marijuana should be legalized? It's a very yes or no question. Or you can say, don't you agree it's a terrible idea to legalize marijuana? If you do it that second way, people may change their answer, even though it's sort of the same question. When you're constructing questions about people's memories and trying to see where they were, is like, is it true that you were at this shopping mall on June 3rd when the incident took place? Well, yes. Where were you on the night of June 3rd, blah, 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 right? And if you change the way the question is, or you change, right, you may be able to cause some of this misinformation or misattribution. And it takes into account questioning that actual witness's memory. One of the last things we'll talk about is deja vu. And deja vu is that eerie sense that you've experienced it before. It's that eerie feeling of doing that. And a lot of people ask me about deja vu and how neuroscience and psychology tries to explain it. Did you actually live in some past life and you're bringing it up? Or what's going on with this? And the best answer from the neuroscience and psychology perspective is priming, right? So a lot of times you have sensory memories or things like that that never fully made it into conscious, explicit memory. Maybe they're hanging around, and or maybe they happened recently, or something like that. And so what you do is you have accidentally primed something. You see something, hear something, smell something, right? And it gives a little memory of, whoa, I've done this before. So that's the best explanation from a neuroscience and psychology perspective, is that cues from the current situation may unconsciously prime or trigger the retrieval of some earlier experience that you didn't even know that you had or that you remembered. I will say this, that there was one time that I can't explain. I was in the car, it was high school, with two of my best friends, Jason and Ken. And I remember I was driving, Jason was in the passenger seat, Ken was in the back seat. And it triggered a deja vu so vivid that I remembered what Ken was going to say, and I said it at the exact same time he did. I don't ever remember having a memory or being in a situation like that with him before. And it was so vivid that I actually said the words that he said, which freaked me out. but that's the only incidents like that I've ever had. And anytime I've ever experienced deja vu, other than that one weird time, this could explain it, because it's just little things like that. So that's my best explanation for it. For that really, really crazy one, I couldn't tell you. Sometimes it's just crazy. So what this tells us is that false memories and misinformation can still feel like real memories. We can still pass a lie detector test, and they can be really persistent. A lot of times they're limited to the gist of the event. We can't recall more specific information about them. And as I said, these false memories are often a result of faulty eyewitness testimony. You got things mixed up. When you recalled them, information got changed. The way that the lawyer answered the question or asked the question caused you to misremember, right? This is an actual thing because our memories are not as rock solid as we had hoped they would be. So, looking at information and research on children's eyewitness recall, we find that children are really, really good at answering questions and being very truthful. If you were to give them something false or suggestive questions in interviewing, that tends to change their answer. So Cece and Bruck did a study where researchers studied the effect of suggestive interviewing techniques. So let's just say that you were telling the children a story about Bobby and Jane and what they did. The children will remember really well, and they'll be very truthful about it. But if you were to say in the questions, what about the red balloon that Bobby gave Jane? Then they would go, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And Bobby gave Jane a red balloon. 58% of preschoolers tended to produce false stories about one or more unexperienced events. In the original story, there was no red balloon, but if the person interviewing them brought it up, they would say, oh, yeah. So it shows that children are really suggestible and will take these things and take them as truth because they often accurately recall real life events fine. When the person's neutral, when the questions are non-leading, they give a really good account of the story. If you give them suggestions like there was balloons or ice cream in the story when it wasn't there, they will go with that and add it to the story, producing a somewhat false memory. And guess what? It's exactly the same for adults. So the debate between one of the biggest controversial things is people who are professionals and really believe that they know what they're doing, and they're trying to convert repressed memories. So these are, maybe somebody has claimed there was sexual assault that happened or something bad, and Freud would say that they pushed that memory down. Maybe it happened before they were the age of 3, right? So there's a big debate between memory researchers and well-meaning therapists to focus on what these therapists do, which is recover these repressed memories. So you may have heard stories of people going to a therapist and the therapist says, okay, I'm going to put you under hypnosis and then go back and search through your memory. When you were 3 years old, did somebody touch you inappropriately? And all of a sudden they have this big realization and they find out that it was Uncle Jim was there and he was touching me. And then they say, aha, got it. And then Uncle Jim gets a visit from the police and you know how this goes. So there's a huge debate. And now knowing what you know, what I've provided about memory, what do you think about this? The debate is between memory researchers and well-meaning therapists that focus on whether these memories of early childhood that were recovered using therapy were actually recovered memories, or were they using suggestive techniques saying, who do you see there? Is it somebody that you know? Is it your uncle, right? Things like that. Knowing that our memories can be implanted as false, knowing about infantile amnesia and not really having memories before we had command of language and a fully formed hippocampus, and knowing that suggestive questions, especially for children, can be very effective tools. Do you think that they're actually recovering memories? Or do you think it's more about the way that they're suggesting things? I know where I stand on the latter side, that these memories can't be recovered the way you think. But that's up to you, really, right? You're individual, you can decide for yourself. I just provide certain information and what research tells you. Last thing that I'll go over really quick, because this is one of the longer lectures, is thinking about, for next week's exam, that ways to study and to maybe make the best use of this chapter to try to remember the information. Well, we can use the SQ3R method, which is survey, question, read, retrieve, and review. And it incorporates several strategies. So let's just go over those really quick. Rehearse repeatedly. Again, continued spaced out studying, re-encoding that information makes it stronger when it's encoded into long-term memory. Make sure to get lots of sleep. Sometimes neutral information is kind of boring and our brain doesn't really choose to remember it. We have to go over it more. So try to use those mnemonic devices. Try to make the information or the material more meaningful. The 3 C's for color, for cones: color, clarity, center. Instead of calling it the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, call it the 2-Dix model. And of course that may make you laugh, but it also may make you think, oh, 2-Dix model, sensory memory, short-term working memory, long-term memory, right? Use mnemonic devices. Activate retrieval cues. Try to find ways that you can remember it. So maybe give examples to some of these things like I do and say, oh, that's how I can remember LTP. I remember, right, 1.0 and 2.0. Minimize your interference. Try not to learn it in a different way. Of course, sleep more so that it consolidates. And above all else, in addition, test your own knowledge, both to rehearse it and to figure out which things you know better and which things you're struggling with, and you may need to use some of these methods above. The study guide is a perfect way to go over and say, oh, I already know this one. Oh, I don't know this one so well. Maybe I'll check on this one. And these are the ways for you to study better for the next exam. So I hope you enjoyed this longer lecture. And as always, I'll talk to you soon.